America's coasts are not one coastline, but many. Granite and fog in New England, barrier islands and boardwalks along the mid-Atlantic, marshes and shrimp boats in the south, volcanic headlands and redwood shadows in the Pacific Northwest, and in California, a shoreline where beach culture sits beside some of the most dramatic coastal geology on the continent. The 10 towns ahead aren't simply pretty places by the sea. Each one is a working archive of how Americans have lived with the ocean, building lighthouses, carving harbors into rock, laying down boardwalk planks, and, in a few cases, learning to retreat from the water as storms and erosion redraw the edge of land. Start in Bar Harbor, Maine, where the Atlantic meets the granite spine of Mount Desert Island. Bar Harbor's identity is inseparable from Acadia National Park, established in 1916 and shaped by philanthropists who helped preserve the island's mountains and shoreline when the area was already a fashionable summer refuge. The town's Gilded Age cottages were anything but modest, and although many were lost to a devastating fire in 1947, the era still lingers in the town's layout and the tradition of scenic drives. The coastline here is a study in hard rock and cold water, pink granite ledges, spruce forests leaning toward the surf, and the famous phenomenon of Bar Island, accessible on foot for a few hours at low tide by a natural sandbar. Visit early in the day when the light is clean and the tide charts are your best friend. The return trip can be cut off quickly. For cliffs and wave-battered views, Acadia's Ocean Path and the headlands around Thunder Hole deliver the sound and spray that made this coast legendary among painters and photographers. Bar Harbor is best approached as both town and trailhead. Eat like a harbor community. Lobster, yes, but also chowders and local oysters. Then let the park's carriage roads and sea cliffs do the heavy lifting. Continue down the Atlantic to Newport, Rhode Island, a place where coastal scenery and architectural ambition face each other across a narrow strip of land. Newport's harbor helped make it an early colonial trading center. Later, it became a summer stage for America's wealthiest families. The Cliff Walk is the town's signature, a public path tracing the edge of the sea beneath mansions that read like a catalog of Gilded Age taste. The Breakers, Marble House, Rosecliff, built with the fortunes of industry and finance. Here, cliffs are less vertical walls than rugged, wave-cut rock shelves that force the path to twist and climb. On windy days, the Atlantic can feel close enough to touch. Newport's maritime credibility runs deeper than mansion tours. It's a sailing town with a long, competitive tradition, and its waterfront is lined with working docks and marinas. For a lighthouse note, nearby Castle Hill Lighthouse marks the entrance to Narragansett Bay, a favorite stop at sunset when the beam begins its steady sweep. Travel tip: Newport is at its most enjoyable in shoulder seasons, late spring or early fall, when you can walk the Cliff Walk without crowds and still catch the harbor's sailing rhythm. For classic boardwalk Americana, Atlantic City, New Jersey remains one of the country's defining coastal inventions. The Atlantic City Boardwalk, first built in 1870, is often described as the first boardwalk in the United States, a practical solution to keep sand out of hotel lobbies that became a cultural institution. Even when the city's fortunes have risen and fallen, the boardwalk has stayed as a public promenade where the ocean is always just to the east, visible between piers and storefronts. Atlantic City also carries a surprisingly rich history of American entertainment and popular culture. The Miss America pageant began here in 1921, originally as a tourism booster at the end of summer. Today, the most rewarding way to experience Atlantic City is to treat it as a study in reinvention. Walk the boards early, when the light hits the water and the city feels more like a seaside resort than a casino district. Then visit Absecon Lighthouse, New Jersey's tallest, first lit in 1857, whose climb rewards you with a clear sense of how barrier island cities sit low and exposed against the Atlantic. Farther south, Cape May, New Jersey, offers a different kind of coastal town, one built from preservation rather than reinvention. After a major fire in 1878, Cape May rebuilt in a dense collection of Victorian-era architecture that still defines the streetscape. It's now a National Historic Landmark city, and that isn't a marketing flourish. It's an unusually intact record of late 19th century resort design. The beaches are broad and gentle, but the town's real drama comes from the meeting of ocean and bay at the southern tip of the state. Sunset Beach, with views across the Delaware Bay, is famous for evening skies and for the concrete ship Atlantis, a World War I-era experiment in shipbuilding that now sits stranded offshore, slowly being claimed by the water. For lighthouse lovers, Cape May Lighthouse has been guiding mariners since 1859, and the nearby Cape May Point State Park adds dunes, birding, and a sense of coastal ecology. Cape May is also one of North America's great migratory bird crossroads. In autumn, hawks and songbirds funnel along the Cape, turning a beach weekend into a natural history field trip. On the outer banks of North Carolina, the town of Nags Head sits on a long, fragile ribbon of sand that has always been in motion. Barrier islands are not fixed landforms. They migrate with storms and currents, and the outer banks make that reality visible. Nags Head's culture is tied to fishing, beach cottages, and the practical knowledge of living with wind and water. Nearby Jockey's Ridge State Park holds the tallest natural sand dune system in the eastern United States, a landscape that feels almost desert-like under a coastal sky. The lighthouse story here is essential. The Outer Banks are known as the graveyard of the Atlantic because shifting shoals and storms caused countless shipwrecks. While Cape Hatteras Lighthouse is south in Buxton, its black and white spiral and its 1999 relocation inland, moved to escape shoreline erosion, offer one of the most vivid American examples of engineering meeting coastal change. When you visit Nags Head, plan for wind. It's part of the experience, perfect for kite flying and for understanding why these lighthouses were so crucial. Charleston, South Carolina, is not a beach town in the narrow sense. It's a coastal city whose story is braided with the sea, and its nearby island communities make it a compelling stop for travelers who want history with their shoreline. Charleston's harbor shaped early American trade and conflict, and Fort Sumter, where the Civil War began in 1861, still sits as a stark reminder that coastlines are strategic as well as scenic. For beach time, Sullivan's Island and Folly Beach offer easy access to the Atlantic, each with its own personality. Sullivan's feels residential and historic. Folly leans surf town casual. The lighthouse highlight is the Morris Island Lighthouse, built in 1876 and now standing offshore, separated from the land by erosion. A haunting, photogenic symbol of a coastline that refuses to stay put. Charleston's best travel tip is to treat water as a transportation network, not just a view. Harbor cruises, ferry rides, and marsh walks reveal the Low Country's tidal ecosystems, creeks, Spartina grass, and the slow pulse that governs daily life. On Florida's Atlantic coast, St. Augustine claims a special place as the oldest continuously occupied European-established settlement in what is now the United States, founded by the Spanish in 1565. That history is not abstract here. It's built into coquina stone walls and narrow streets. The Castillo de San Marcos, begun in 1672, still overlooks the water, constructed from coquina, a local shellstone that absorbs cannon fire rather than shattering, an early example of material science shaping military architecture. For lighthouse seekers, The St. Augustine Lighthouse on Anastasia Island, completed in 1874, offers both a climb and a museum that connects maritime navigation to the region's shipwreck history. The beaches nearby are wide and approachable, and the town's cultural mix, Spanish colonial roots, later British control, and American expansion, creates a layered sense of place. Visit in the morning for the historic district, then cross to the barrier island for salt air and sea oats. It's a satisfying way to feel how the city and the coast have always depended on one another. On the Pacific, Monterey, California pairs ocean scenery with a powerful environmental and cultural narrative. Monterey was once the center of California's sardine industry, memorialized in the former Cannery Row, now transformed into a waterfront district where the past is visible in the bones of old industrial buildings. The collapse of the sardine fishery in the mid-20th century is a cautionary tale about overfishing and ocean ecosystems, and it helped push the region toward marine research and conservation. Today, the Monterey Bay Aquarium stands as one of the world's most influential public aquariums, notable for its work on sea otter rehabilitation and its exhibits that explain kelp forests as living architecture. The coastal drive along 17 Mile Drive and the rocky shores of Point Lobos nearby deliver cliffs, cypress trees shaped by wind, and tide pools that turn low tide into a guided lesson in intertidal life. For travelers, Monterey rewards patience. Bring layers for fog and wind, and schedule time for simply watching the water. In winter, gray whales migrate past the bay. In calmer seasons, sea otters float in kelp like punctuation marks on the surface. Farther north, Mendocino, California, sits high above the Pacific on bluffs where the coastline breaks into coves, sea stacks, and headlands. Unlike many West Coast towns, Mendocino has a distinct New England feel, the result of its 19th century lumber era and the architectural styles brought by settlers and builders. The town's wooden buildings and salt box silhouettes look out over a shoreline that is anything but gentle. Mendocino Headlands State Park wraps the village in open grass and cliff-edge paths where the ocean's scale becomes the main attraction. This is a place for slow walking and careful footing. The bluffs are dramatic and the wind can be insistent. Nearby, Point Cabrillo Light Station, first lit in 1909, adds the Lighthouse chapter. Still active, with restored buildings that convey the daily life of keepers who managed light and fog signal in a region where weather can erase the horizon. For a practical tip, book lodging early in peak seasons. Mendocino is small, and its appeal is amplified by that smallness. Finish in the Pacific Northwest with Cannon Beach, Oregon, where the coast feels both cinematic and geologically precise. The town is defined by Haystack Rock, a 235-foot sea stack formed by ancient basalt flows, now protected as part of the Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge. At low tide, the base becomes a living classroom of tide pools, sea stars, anemones, and crabs, where timing matters as much as curiosity. Cannon Beach's shoreline is broad and walkable, often under a veil of mist that turns the ocean into a shifting gray plain. For the lighthouse element, nearby Tillamook Rock Lighthouse, known as Terrible Tilly, sits offshore on a wave-battered rock, completed in 1881, and infamous for the difficulty of building and supplying it.
While you can't casually stroll to it, its story is woven into local lore and speaks to the extreme measures taken to make this coast navigable. Travel here with an eye on the tides and the weather. A sunny afternoon can arrive suddenly, and a storm can be just as sudden, turning the beach into a front-row seat for Pacific drama. Taken together, these towns map a national coastline of contrasts. Boardwalk engineering and barrier island fragility, cliff walks and sea stacks, lighthouse beams and the modern realities of erosion and conservation. The best way to visit them is with two kinds of attention at once. One is sensory: wind, salt, the sound of surf against rock or sand. The other is historical: how people made homes, industries, and traditions at the edge of a restless ocean. In every one of these places, the shoreline is not a backdrop. It's the main character, still writing new chapters with every tide.